met yet, my name is Kaitlin Hile. I am a cardiology clinical pharmacist by day, and then became extremely interested in federal student loans for both personal and professional reasons. Really did a deep dive doing a course through the Certified Student Loan Institute, and have done a lot of research figuring out how the system works and how we can make it work better for healthcare professionals like myself. And so this has really become a passion area for me. And now I work with the Millionaires in Medicine team, helping healthcare professionals just like you guys figure out a student loan and investing and saving strategy that gets you exactly where you want to go. So that brings me a lot of joy. I'm super excited to dive in tonight to talk about all things federal student loans. Now, we can't talk about federal student loans without just giving a brief plug that this is one piece of the puzzle, right? There's so many different facets of your financial life. And if you get tunnel vision and you're only thinking about like, what do I do with my loans? What do I do with my loans? You're missing a lot of the rest. So keep that in mind. This is a very important piece of the puzzle. Don't get me wrong. I love talking about it. That's what we're here for today. But I want to make sure you're thinking about your investing, your savings, any other debts that you might have. I see all sorts of things when people come into our program, and maybe we're prioritizing things in a way that doesn't quite make sense. And so keep in mind, this is one piece of the puzzle, but we'll go ahead and dive in and talk about all things federal student loans. So you guys know it's been an eventful year. My goodness, it's been a lot to keep up with from a student loan standpoint. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a vibe check. Let's see. So go ahead, throw in the chat. Which of these describes best how you're feeling? Maybe it's all of the above. Maybe it's something else. You can throw in words, whatever you guys are thinking. Let me know what your current opinion is, how you're currently feeling about everything that's been going on. Camille says 1. Tyler says 2. We got some 1s and 2s. Okay. A lot of 1s and 2s, totally fair. I feel like the 1 is like how I kind of feel in this moment as well. So I'm glad I'm not alone in that. Hopefully we can debunk some of the things that are going on, some of the scary headlines that you've seen, and make it make sense. So that's what we're going to do today. All right. First, we've got to zoom out, right? When you think about federal student loans, there's really 4 main approaches that the majority of people can take. So there's always standard 10-year repayment. You could also do an accelerated repayment, and then there's taxable loan forgiveness and public service loan forgiveness, or PSLF. Now, there's some other options out there, so don't see this and say, oh, those are the only 4 options, but far and away, these are the most common 4 pathways that our healthcare professionals are pursuing. So we'll talk about each of these individually and kind of do a deep dive on those. Your standard 10-year repayment. This is going to be the default option for most federal student loans. So if you don't do anything when you graduate and you just see, what they enroll you in, it would be the standard 10-year repayment almost always. Now, the good thing is you get to be debt-free in 10 years, so that's nice. There's no employment restrictions, which we'll see with the PSLF pathway that we'll talk about in a moment. But the downside is that these payments are determined by your loan balance and not by your income. So if you're doing a residency, right, that you're making like half of what you could be making, that payment could be significant compared to your income. Or even just as a new grad, maybe your first job offer wasn't quite as competitive as you thought it would be. Or maybe you just have a massive loan balance. If you owe $300,000, the standard 10-year repayment is high, right? It's not going to be easy to pull that off. And so you can end up having a huge monthly bill. And of course, you end up still paying a lot in interest. You're paying it off over 10 years. And so there's a lot of interest that can accrue in that time frame. Now, you could also do an accelerated repayment. You get to really DIY your pathway here. So you can be debt-free on any time horizon that meets your goals. And so you'll save a lot of money on interest. Let's say you get really aggressive and you're like, I'm going to pay this off in 5 years. Well, you're going to save quite a bit on interest, but my goodness, is that monthly payment going to be high? Oftentimes you are still paying a good amount in interest. It's a lot less than the standard 10-year repayment though. Now, this is the key, is these payments can be a huge percentage of your monthly cash flow. So what I see a lot is people delay investing, they delay building up their savings because they're like, I'm going to pay off my student loans as fast as humanly possible. And while I love the intentionality, I love the hustle, I can't even count how many people we've worked with that had been so focused and so diligent from a student loan standpoint, And then they realize, oh, I'm like really far behind from an investing standpoint. And now I've got to really pick up the pace to get to my retirement dreams. Or, they realize an emergency comes up and they didn't have the appropriate savings in place. And so that can hit really hard when you're not prepared for it. So that's the huge risk with the accelerated repayment pathway. A lot of people just get carried away, and every single dollar they can scrounge up goes towards the federal student loans. And it's a great idea. You just have to be careful that you're actually balancing all of the other important pieces of your financial puzzle. Okay, so that's accelerated repayment. Now we've got public service loan forgiveness, or PSLF. So to be in PSLF, you're going to enroll in an income-driven repayment plan, or IDR. That's an umbrella term, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But you should enroll in an income-driven repayment plan if you're going to do PSLF. So that's going to make your monthly payment based off of your income and not based off of however much you owe. So your monthly payment would be the same regardless of if you owe 50,000 or 450,000. So that's going to free up a lot of cash flow for you to be investing, savings, maybe buying a home or traveling, like whatever's important to you. It allows a lot of extra flexibility in that monthly cash flow. Now, oftentimes for our healthcare professionals, you can have a large amount forgiven at the end of these 10 years. So especially if you have a high debt to income ratio, like 3-to-1, 4-to-1, this could be a life-changing amount of student loan debt forgiven after 120 payments. Now, what's the downside? You have to work for a qualifying employer for 10 years or 120 qualifying payments. Now, what's a qualifying employer? It has to be a non-for-profit or a government employer. So the good thing is in healthcare, there's a lot of options available to you that would be PSLF qualifying. And then if you're going to do PSLF, you've got to get your ducks in a row. You have to submit the appropriate paperwork, and you need to make sure that you're actually getting credit for the months that you should be. And so it does take a little bit of more diligence on your end to make sure that you're getting the credit that's due. Now, for a lot of people, when they see how much could be forgiven at the end, they're like, yeah, it's worth $150,000 being forgiven tax-free in order for me to submit my papers annually, right? Like, I think that's worth it. But that is an important consideration if you're due to go down this pathway. All right, so next we've got taxable loan forgiveness. If you're doing taxable loan forgiveness, you're on an income-driven repayment plan. So basically, if you're on an income-driven repayment plan and you're not at a PSLF qualifying employer, you're doing taxable loan forgiveness whether you realized it or not. So that's an important distinction. So again, just like we talked about with PSLF, if you're on an income-driven repayment plan, that payment is based off of your income, not your loan balance, and so you're freeing up additional cash flow for other goals. Now, you can still have a large amount forgiven at the end of this 20 to 25 year time horizon. But the key here is that amount that's forgiven is taxed as ordinary income. And so you got to prepare for this tax bomb that comes at the time of forgiveness. Now, we've had people that we've said, hey, you're 5 years away from taxable loan forgiveness, and you're predicted to owe about $100,000 in taxes. That's not news anybody wants to get, right? But can you imagine if they had just filed their taxes that year and then the TurboTax generated, hey, you owe 100 grand, and they're like, what? So you've got to be prepared for that. This is a much longer time horizon as well. Depending on the income-driven repayment plan, it's a 20 to 25 year time horizon. And a lot of people just don't want their student loans hanging over their heads for 20 to 25 years. It's a really long time. And then the main thing to keep in mind here is when you add in the tax bill that's due at the end of this forgiveness timeframe, for the majority of people, this is the most expensive way for you to pay back your student loans. And so what happens oftentimes is people see like, oh, I can get a low monthly payment with this income-driven repayment plan. That sounds great. I'm going to go with that. They're not at a PSLF qualifying employer, and they're just sticking with this income-driven repayment plan because it makes the monthly payment look better. They don't even realize that they're effectively pursuing taxable loan forgiveness. And so all of a sudden, they're 15 years in and they're like, oh, wait, what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years? Oh, I need to start preparing for that. So it can be a bit of a wake-up call when eventually they realize what's coming down the road for them is a significant amount forgiven, but that's going to generate a very large tax bill. Okay, and then I'm going to take most of the questions at the end, but I want to get Nicole's really quick. So just to clarify, income-driven repayment plus PSLF does not have a tax bomb. Is that correct? Yes, that's exactly right. Your PSLF forgiveness, the amount forgiven at the end of PSLF, is tax-free forgiveness. And so we have a lot of people who are going to have, $300,000, $400,000 forgiven tax-free at the end of those 10 years. Again, that can be life-changing. So that's the big difference here between PSLF and taxable loan forgiveness. PSLF is tax-free forgiveness. Taxable loan forgiveness is taxed as ordinary income. Okay, so going into what are the income-driven repayment plans? Historically, these have been the options. We had the repay plan, but that went away when the save plan came into existence. But with the ongoing litigation, the save plan is not going to exist moving forward. I will be shook to my core if the courts let that continue. So we're not going to talk about it today. We're going to focus on what's left behind. We have the pay plan, the IBR plan, and the ICR plan. Now remember, income-driven repayment, or IDR, that's an umbrella term. That includes all of these options. And so when I have someone say, oh, I'm on the IDR plan, it's like, oh, which one? Because there's a lot of different ones and there's nuances to all of them. So you need to know which of the income-driven repayment plans you're actually on. So pay and IBR are going to be where we're going to talk the most of our time. You'll see that ICR, it's a much higher payment. It's going to be 20% of discretionary income, whereas pay and IBR are somewhere between 10 and 15%. So for the majority of people, ICR is a more expensive option and wouldn't be the best plan. So I'm going to focus in on pay and IBR, and we'll talk more about those. All right, so both of them have the same income protection threshold, which is 150% of the federal poverty limit. Basically, to translate that, before they go to calculate how much you owe in your monthly payment on either of these plans, you're going to subtract out 150% of the federal poverty limit based on your household size from your adjusted gross income. So basically the government's saying, hey, we're not going to count that amount of income, and so you get to subtract a little bit out. That's all it's saying. And these are comparable between the two. The pay plan is 10% of discretionary income, and the IBR plan is either 10 or 15%, and we'll talk about that distinguishing factor in just a second. If you're doing taxable loan forgiveness on the pay plan, it's a 20-year time horizon. IBR is either 20 or 25 years, and we'll talk about that distinction. For both of these, you have to demonstrate what's called partial financial hardship. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that if your monthly payment on the pay or IBR plan is higher than your standard 10-year repayment would be, you don't qualify, which kind of makes sense, right? It doesn't make sense to do an income-driven repayment plan if it would cost you more than a standard 10-year repayment. Doesn't even make sense, but you do have to be able to demonstrate that partial financial hardship in order to qualify for it. So let's dive into IBR a little bit more because I told you there's a little bit of variation. So the key question to ask for the IB as in boy, IBR plan is, did you have a federal student loan balance on July 1st of 2014? If yes, you're considered an old borrower, and that makes your payment 15% of discretionary income and your taxable loan forgiveness time horizon 25 years. If no, you're considered a new borrower, you only have to pay 10% of discretionary income, and your taxable loan forgiveness time horizon is 20 years. Now, that probably feels so arbitrary, and it's just based off of when some of these changes rolled out in the IBR plan and the pay plan. So I know it feels silly, and you're like, gosh darn it, why am I being penalized for starting school in 2013? You're not alone. So this is a good kind of summary slide for you all. Breaking down the pay plan and new IBR are basically the exact same, right? Old IBR is where you would pay a little bit more because it's 15% of discretionary income, and that taxable loan forgiveness duration is 25 years instead of 20 for pay or a new IBR. So I hope that the distinction makes sense. Now, these are just some example numbers to show you what the differences can look like. So this is an estimated $300,000 in federal student loan debt, and you make about 150K. Standard 10-year repayment, you can see like this is a hefty monthly payment of $3,500. If you want to pay it off over 5 years, you're going to be paying $6,100 a month. That's next to impossible for the vast majority of people making 150K a year if you have any type of living expenses. And then if you decided to do the pay plan or new IBR, you'd be paying about $970 a month. So you can see how gosh darn tempting this monthly payment is compared to the $3,500. Now, when you look at the total cost of repayment, which is what we really need to focus on and not just get carried away with the lower monthly payment, you can see if I do standard 10-year repayment in this example, I would pay about $400,000 back. If I paid it off in 5 years, I'd save about $55,000 in interest and only pay $345,000. If I do that taxable loan forgiveness pathway and I'm on the pay plan, but I'm not at a qualifying employer, so it's going to be 20 years later, my total cost would be about $413K when you add in the estimated tax bill. But if I do public service loan forgiveness and I'm on the pay plan, my total cost of repayment is only $120,000. So you can see in this example of a debt to income ratio of 2 to 1, in this scenario, PSLF is a huge game changer for this individual. And so this is going to look different for everybody, right? Like I can't tell you exactly what would be most optimal for you in your individual situation, but I can show you why it's so important to compare your options because this is saving you $280,000 by doing public service loan forgiveness instead of standard 10-year repayment. That's a good chunk of change, right? I think people would be willing to do a lot to save $280,000. And so that's why it's so important to know all of your options and know how it all applies to you, what's going to make the most sense for you, and get that personalized student loan strategy plan so that you know what your options look like and you can weigh your pros and cons. All right. So if you're curious, I kind of alluded to this with the federal poverty line talk, but if you're curious like how these payments are actually calculated, this is it. You're going to take your gross income. You can get that right off your W-2, right? And then you subtract out any pre-tax investments that you made over the course of the year. So let's look, maybe you're looking at your 2024. So you would take your 2024 annual income, subtract out any pre-tax investment you made in 2024. That gives you your adjusted gross income, which is also referred to as your AGI. You're going to see that a lot, AGI. Once you know your AGI, you can subtract out 150% of the federal poverty line based on your household size. And you can just Google like 2024 federal poverty line table and it'll come right up for you. Once you subtract that out, that leaves you with your discretionary income. Now for pay and new IBR, remember those payments are 10% of discretionary income. So you would take 10% of this, divide it by 12, and now you've got your monthly payment. If you're on the IBR plan, but you're an old borrower, so I'll call that old IBR, that's actually going to be 15% of discretionary income. So you would take 15% of that and then divide by 12 to get your monthly payment. So that's kind of how the math works. And you can see, we're going to talk more about this, but you can see how leveraging your pre-tax investments can be a very big deal. A quick rule of thumb is for every $12,000 in pre-tax investments, you can decrease your monthly payment by about $100 a month. So you can see if you get really aggressive from an investing standpoint that you can be winning in multiple areas here. All right, let me show you what this could actually look like. So we've got Jack and Jill. They both make 120K a year, but Jack is going to max out that 401K. So that brings his adjusted gross income. Of course, he's going to do pre-tax contributions, right? So he does pre-tax 401K contributions to max it out. That brings his AGI or adjusted gross income to $96,500. That makes his discretionary income about $73,000. His monthly payment is $615. Now, Jill's not going to make any pre-tax investments, so her AGI is the same as her regular income. It's 120K, and her monthly payment is $811. So you can see that Jack's saving quite a bit on his student loans. Now, what's really cool is when you project this out over the next 10 years, Jack is going to keep maxing out that 401K. At the end of these 10 years, he has $360,000 in his 401k. That's pretty cool. He has paid $75,000 towards his loans, and he gets, in this example, $313K forgiven tax-free through PSLF. Pretty impressive. Now, Jill hasn't invested anything. She's paid about $100,000 towards her student loans and still gets a sizable amount forgiven. But I would rather be in Jack's shoes, right? With $360K invested, and I got even more forgiven tax-free. Now, if you have access to a 457B through your employer, you can get really, really creative from a student loan standpoint. So let's take Sally, for example. She also makes $120K a year, but she said she's going to max out her pre-tax 401K and 457B. That brings her AGI down to $73,000 and her discretionary income $50,000. Take a second to realize that her monthly payment is being calculated off of a discretionary income of $50K when she earns $120K. That is pretty cool. So now her monthly payment is only $417. Remember, Jack's paying $615, Jill's paying like $800 and something. So if Sally keeps doing that for the next 10 years, she has $720,000 between her 401K and 457B. She only paid $51K towards her loans and gets $340,000 forgiven tax-free. So you can see the power of your pre-tax investments, of your pre-tax 401K or 403B, your 457B, your HSA if you're utilizing that, your FSA. These are all tools in the toolbox to really maximize the benefit of public service loan forgiveness. Okay, so that's kind of our quick overview of where are we in just big picture student loan lingo so that we can make sense of all of the other things we're about to talk about, the updates of what has happened over the last year. Before we dive into that, the key to understand is how these student loan or how these IDR plans came to be. Now, the pay plan was issued through a regulatory process. So that is much easier to be subjected to the whims of a court decision, whereas IBR is actually written into a statute. That's written into law. It would take an act of Congress to change the IBR plan. So you can really rest assured knowing that you have access to income-based repayment, the IBR plan, and it would take an act of Congress to make a change to that plan. Now, PAYE and ICR are both through this regulatory process, and so they could very well be impacted by court litigation or other, more rapid changes. But IBR is literally written into law. So that's some of the key nuance there. Okay, and then just a reminder for IBR, if you're wondering new versus old, it's based off if you had that federal student loan balance July 1st of 2014. All right, so now we're going to start with the timeline of walking through what all has happened and try to break down what it means for you. Now, my goal also is to allow quite a bit of time at the end for questions because I know there's going to be a lot of questions and I want to make sure we allow some time to answer them. So we'll start in April of 2024. This is when the lawsuits were initially filed in both Missouri and Kansas against the SAVE plan. And then in July 2024, we had that Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals grant a nationwide injunction on the SAVE plan. This is probably when you started to notice all of the headlines and when a lot of people started to have that sense of like, oh gosh, what's going on? So anyone on the SAVE plan at that time was placed into administrative forbearance. That takes us to January of 2025. That period from July to January was a lot of just a waiting game, trying to figure out what was going on. Now, in January of 2025, right before Biden administration left office, they added an income-driven repayment payment tracker to the federal student aid website. Now, this is a really helpful tool for those that are pursuing taxable loan forgiveness. We've always had the PSLF tracker where you can see like exactly how many qualifying payments you have towards PSLF. But until January of this year, there actually wasn't a tracker available for those pursuing taxable loan forgiveness. So it was really hard for them to know like, how much longer do I have? And like, are you counting what I'm counting? Are we all on the same page? And so that was one of the final things that the Biden administration did was add this in to particularly help those pursuing taxable loan forgiveness at least have clear record of how many payments they have and how they're tracking along. So that brings us into February of 2025, when that same Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the injunction. They blocked SAVE in its entirety, and they also blocked the processing of IDR forgiveness for those in the pay plan or ICR. And remember, pay and ICR were built through the same regulatory process, which is why the courts have a lot more power over those. So in February as well, that same Eighth Circuit Court reaffirmed the broad injunction. They sent it back to the lower court for their final ruling. And they said they don't believe that this taxable loan forgiveness pathway on pay, ICR, or SAVE was ever legal. But importantly, they acknowledged it is under IBR. Remember, IBR is written into law. That's in a statute. And the forgiveness portion of IBR is written into law. And so the great thing is, despite, maybe a lot of people would view this as a negative news for student loan borrowers, they did clearly acknowledge that IBR does have that taxable loan forgiveness pathway built into it. Okay, so I laughed as I was making this slide because the entire timeline for this slide was just things that happened in March of this year. And I was like, oh, that's why I've been so tired trying to keep up with all of this, because a lot happened in a short period of time. So let's break it down. Starting at the beginning of March, they had a stop work order from the Department of Education to the student loan servicers, telling them to pause all forgiveness and application processing. Interestingly, that was not communicated really in any official measure to the public. That was a memo that was uncovered by the Washington Post and was shared kind of with that stop work order. So that caught a lot of people by surprise. Then later this month, in that month, the online IDR application where you would apply for any of these income-driven repayment plans was made unavailable. And the thought process here, or at least the rationale that was given, is that they needed to go in and change, all of these equations and change some of the verbiage and limit what you're able to apply to comply with the court's injunction on SAVE and potentially pay and ICR. All right, so that brings us to an executive order that President Trump signed also in March. It had a longer title, but it was essentially to restore PSLF. And in this executive order, he essentially wanted to exclude any nonprofits that engage in the subsidization of illegal activities. Now, the definition of illegal is a little nuanced, but that was essentially what he was going for with that executive order. Also in March, we had a lawsuit filed by the American Federation of Teachers seeking to restore access to IDR repayment and be able to get PSLF credit. So remember, step 2 in the month of March is when that online IDR application became unavailable. And so people didn't have the option to change income-driven repayment plans. If they had a reduction in income, they didn't have the option to recertify that income and get their payments lowered accordingly. If you were in SAVE forbearance, you were literally just stuck there. You couldn't apply for anything else. And so this American Federation of Teachers, which is a teacher union, filed a lawsuit saying that their members were being irreparably harmed by this because they weren't able to get into an income-driven repayment plan and start getting PSLF credit, which is very common among teachers working at public schools, right? So that lawsuit got filed. Later in the month, we had Trump order the Department of Education to be shut down to the maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law. Now, we have not seen that entire department cease to exist as of right now. The workforce has been decreased by about 50%, and there's been talks of moving the student loan role of the Department of Education to the Small Business Association. That hasn't officially happened yet, and the SBA is not really staffed to be able to meet the needs of all of the student loan borrowers. So we'll see how that actually pans out, but that executive order was filed. All right, one more thing in March, and then we're moving into April. So the IDR application was brought back online, but the applications are still not being processed. So step 1 is they turned on the application, but nothing is actually going through as of right now. And when they brought that application back online, you are able to apply for income-based repayment, pay, or ICR, and you can no longer apply for the SAVE plan, which I don't think surprised anybody. Moving into April, we saw a lot of people have their income-driven repayment income recertification deadlines tentatively delayed, usually until 2026. Now, I would take that with a grain of salt because if you're on pay or ICR, and the court strikes those down and says that you need to switch into IBR, there's a good chance you would have to recertify your income at that time. So I would be ready at any time, but of course we would gladly welcome a delay in the need to recertify our income. And we can talk more about that at the end, but that usually benefits the majority of borrowers. Also in April, we saw the reported intent announced to change IDR repayment calculations for married borrowers who are filing separately. And they announced this on a Friday, and then the whole weekend and Monday was like news headlines and student loan borrowers being super stressed out. If you're married filing separately, that all of a sudden my spouse's income is going to count as income for me, and my payments are going to go up a lot. Very quickly, the Department of Education said, oops, sorry, that's not what we meant. So they actually clarified this to say, we're not going to include your spousal income if you're married filing separately, but we will include your spouse in the household size. Now, remember, when we talked about how student loan payments are calculated, you get to subtract out 150% of the federal poverty line based on your household size. And of course, that poverty line is higher and higher as your household size grows. And so it actually works in your favor to get to count your spouse in that household size, and you get to subtract a little bit more out as your income protection threshold. So it started off with a lot of chaos, but thankfully that clarification eased a lot of concerns in that area and actually benefits borrowers that are married filing separately. All right, brings us a little bit forward in April, where they announced that they're going to be doing negotiated rulemaking, which is the same process that Biden used to create the SAVE plan. Basically, they bring in a lot of key stakeholders and they attempt to come to a consensus on what changes they want to make. And they've said that their focus is going to be on pay, ICR, and PSLF. Now, before you get too stressed out about the fact that PSLF is mentioned in here, from what we've been told, this group is primarily focusing on how to enact President Trump's executive order that wanted to restrict qualifying employers. If your employer is pursuing illegal activity, you would not be eligible for PSLF. And so they're trying to figure out, like, A, who decides, what employers do and don't count? B, how do we, notify borrowers? There's so many unanswered questions with that. I could go on and on. So that's the primary focus that they're trying to figure out from a PSLF standpoint. I will also say that the second they try to restrict a non-for-profit and say they no longer qualify for PSLF, there's going to be court cases because the PSLF statute just says you have to work for a 501c3, which is a non-for-profit. Nowhere in the statute does it give the president the authority to select individual employers and say these ones no longer qualify. So that will be challenged in the courts, and we'll have to see what the courts decide. The aspect of pay and ICR that's going to be discussed is, we'll see what the courts right now do regarding if they want to allow taxable loan forgiveness on pay or ICR. If they say no, that, we're not going to do taxable loan forgiveness on pay or ICR, then the question is really, okay, well, should these plans still exist? Because they would still count towards public service loan forgiveness. And so maybe do we keep them available for PSLF borrowers? Do we want to create a new income-driven repayment plan and maybe replace them? There's a whole host of things they might do, but this negotiated rulemaking process is underway. They're supposed to have that first hearing at the end of this month or early May. And then those rules have to be published by November of this year in order to go into effect in July of 2026. There is also going to be a period of public commentary. And so, this is something that if you have opinions on the matter and you're like, hey, this is impacting me, you can weigh in, you can share your opinion, and, make sure your voice is being heard. All right. Whew. Lastly, we've got in April, the Department of Education announced that starting early May, it's going to resume collections on federal student loans. that are in default. So what that means is, basically up until March of 2020 during the COVID pandemic, if your student loans, federal student loans went into default, you were sent into collections and they could garnish your wages, they can withhold your tax refund, your pension, your social security, any like federal payout can be withheld if you're in default on your loans. And then during the COVID pandemic, that was all put on pause and no loans were sent to collections between March 2020 and now. And they've announced that that's going to go back into effect early May. So hopefully that doesn't apply to anybody. If that does, we can explore options to get you out of default and onto an income-driven repayment plan or a forbearance period, whatever is needed. But I do want to make sure people are aware that those are the ramifications that can happen if you go into default. And a lot of borrowers that maybe graduated during that time of, 2020 to now have never had to worry about all of these nuances. And so I don't want anybody to think, oh, like I've been in default for a year, nothing happened, it's fine. It's going to start happening very shortly. And then lastly, the Department of Education has said that starting, I think it was May 10th, that they're going to start processing the IDR applications. Now, this is going to be interesting because a report came out that there's actually 2 million requests currently in the queue. 2 million. And that's going to take a while to sort through. And the staff has already been reduced significantly. And so that's going to be a very heavy lift for the employees that are left behind. And so I don't know what our processing times are going to look like, but I can't imagine they're going to be very fast. So reportedly, May 10th is when they're going to start working their way through that pile. But I don't know what to tell you in terms of how long it's going to take. So we'll see. All right, so you're probably wondering, like, what should I do now? Okay, if you're doing public service loan forgiveness, you've got to keep your ducks in a row. I want you to save all of your documents in a separate location, on your computer, in your Google Drive, print them off, whatever works for you. You need to have screenshots and proof of your PSLF tracker with that detailed breakdown of what payments are qualifying, which ones are not. Have proof of your employment certification history and your studentaid.gov dashboard. Like, I want you to have photo evidence of everything you could imagine just to double check yourself, right? Like, the last thing that you would ever want is, 5 years from now to be like, if I had just screenshotted that when I looked at it at that time. So just be overly diligent in your documentation here. And this has actually come in handy. Like, I just spoke with a former coaching client a couple of weeks ago who noticed that her interest was inappropriately accruing while she's in save forbearance. And they started adding interest to her loans, which is supposed to be an interest-free period, right? And she had those clear screenshots to say, hey, this was my balance on this date. This is my balance now. You've changed something and you need to change it back. And so having those clear records can really work in your favor. Now, normally, for the second bullet point, normally I would have you certify your employment annually. Once a year, have your employer sign the form that says, yes, they've worked full-time here. We will sign off on this and you'll get your qualifying payments. Now, with all of the chaos currently going on, I would just do that every 3 months and then redo your screenshots and make sure you have your ducks in a row. Is that overkill? I hope so. But, you're working hard to get these 120 qualifying payments, and I don't want you to lose a single one due to inappropriate record keeping or administrative errors on your student loan servicer's end. So I want you to be overly diligent as you're making sure you're getting for each and every dollar that you're putting towards your student loans. Now, I want to clarify, when I say recertify your employment, that is just having your employer sign off on the form. This is not recertifying your income. Those are two different processes. Please do not recertify your income every 3 months. You'll end up paying way more than you need to. Don't do that. This is recertifying employment that I'm referring to. If you're doing PSLF, you've got to make sure you're maximizing the benefit of PSLF, right? We need to evaluate your pre-tax investments, your tax filing status. What can we do to really move the needle and get the most bang for your buck out of PSLF? And that's really where this like individualized approach comes into play of, what accounts do you have access to? How can we, fit this into your investing plan and make sure we're lowering your AGI as much as possible? If you're married or planning to get married, how does that affect your investing approach? But also, how do we leverage that to help from a student loan standpoint as well? And some of that depends, like, are you in an equitable distribution state or a community property state? And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't even know all these words, that's okay. That's what we're here for. But you can see how incredibly complex it becomes. And there's a lot of different factors to keep in mind to make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck from a public service loan forgiveness standpoint. And then the big question, I get this all the time, is if I'm on save forbearance, when is the right time for me to apply to a different plan? Now, this can be really individualized. And if you're somebody that is working on paying off high interest rate debt, when I say high interest, I mean an interest rate greater than 10%. I would stay and save forbearance. So my student loans aren't accruing interest, and I can really hone in on that high interest debt and tackle that as quickly as possible. If you're not investing 20% yet, we need to hustle towards that goal. And so it also would be reasonable to stay and save forbearance a little bit longer while you increase your investments, or maybe you build up that emergency fund, like whatever other goals you're working on, that's reasonable. But you have to keep in mind that the save forbearance is not getting you credit towards public service loan forgiveness. So you are kind of extending the amount of time that you need to work full time at a qualifying employer. So that's the downside. The upside is it allows you the opportunity to really tackle some of these other key financial goals and get yourself in a better spot. The other piece is I don't know when they're going to end save forbearance. There's a lot of talk that it's going to be this summer. Who knows, right? This is all speculation. We're just going to have to wait and see what the courts say and how they decide to handle the closing of the save plan, and if they want, how they're going to transition people to other income-driven repayment plans. That's really the golden question. If you're doing taxable loan forgiveness, you also need to save all of these documents. I talked about that IDR payment tracker getting added. You need to make sure you have record of all of your qualifying payments towards taxable loan forgiveness so that you know what credit you have and how much longer you have to go. You need to make sure that you've zoomed out and looked at the big picture. For the vast majority of people, this is the most expensive way for you to pay off your student loans. So you need to know, what is the opportunity cost of doing this taxable loan forgiveness approach? And then you also need to know, what's my tax bill going to look like? And am I going to be ready to pay for that? It's so easy to say, oh, like that's a problem for 10 years from now, I'll deal with it later. But if you're saving up $100,000, it takes a bit, right? Like most people aren't going to save that up in 1, maybe 2 years. Like you might need to plan ahead for that. And so you've got to zoom out. If you're doing taxable loan forgiveness, I would think long and hard and do a lot of digging to make sure that that's actually the right plan for you. 9 times out of 10, when I have somebody come in on taxable loan forgiveness pathway, that's not where we end up when we fully evaluate all of the options available to them and how it fits into their entire financial plan. It's usually not the best approach. Okay, what if you're doing standard or accelerated repayment? The good news is you're highly unlikely to be impacted by any of this ongoing litigation, political changes, and so hopefully that gives you a little bit of peace of mind. The other part to keep in mind is, remember, we've talked about this, your student loans are one piece of the puzzle, right? And I don't want you to be the person that gets tunnel vision and says, oh, I can pay off my student loans in 10 years or faster. And you're gung-ho, I'm going to pay these off so fast, it's going to be great. And then you realize that now, it's not going to be feasible to reduce work hours when you want. Or if you wanted an early retirement, now it's going to be really, really hard to make that a reality because you're behind from an investing standpoint. And so you've got to be making sure you're on track for multiple different goals all at once and how all of them intertwine together. And that's what we do, right? Like we create this cohesive plan to make sure you're hitting all of those goals. But it's so common to see people really trying so hard to succeed and like, hey, I'm going to tackle these loans. I don't like having debt. And that's a great mindset to have. But you'll probably look back and say, oh, I wish I had invested a little bit more while balancing that out. And so it's all about striking the right balance between these goals. And that's a lot of times the discussions that we're having with our clients is, how do we make sure you're hitting both of these targets at once? The most important thing you need to be doing right now is staying informed. for so long, especially if you're somebody that graduated during the COVID pandemic timeframe, you've kind of been able to take a back seat and say like, oh, like I'm on save plan, which is a pretty low payment. Now I've been in forbearance for a while. Maybe you just haven't had to worry about your student loan strategy yet. That's going to change very, very quickly. You've got to stay informed. And even if you've already kind of decided what you think you want to do with your student loans, you really need to keep up with what political changes are happening, what court changes are happening, and how does it affect you? Now, I'm the debt and budgeting coach in our coaching program. And so every single week, I update our clients on like, hey, here are the things that happened in the last week. And then here's how it applies to each of you. And we break it down like, this is what you actually need to worry about so that you're not getting caught in like the whim of the headlines that can feel really stressful. So that's going to be so important. You've got to actually know what's going on and know how it applies to you. We've seen already a huge increase in administrative errors from the student loan servicers. So I told you about the example of, interest being applied inappropriately for somebody on save forbearance. That's supposed to be interest free. You should not be accruing interest during that time. And we were able to catch that error and get it rectified. I've also had someone who was doing public service loan forgiveness. They applied for an income-driven repayment plan. I believe it was like IBR that they applied for. And their student loan servicer put them on the extended repayment plan. That's not even a qualifying plan for PSLF. And so those payments that they were making don't even count for PSLF, which is terrifying to think about, that they're taking hard-earned money. They're working at their qualifying employer. They're doing what they thought they were supposed to be doing, and they're not getting credit for that. And so like these types of, silly errors can have huge ramifications. Now, thankfully, we caught that error very quickly about the extended repayment plan, and they were able to get it fixed. But imagine like if you didn't catch that, and now 5 years down the road, you think, oh, sweet, I'm halfway through PSLF, and you realize none of those payments qualified. That makes my stomach hurt just to think about. That would be terrible. And so you really need to start doing your due diligence. You've got to keep a close eye on things. We talked about saving your records. The ball's really in your court to make sure your student loan strategy gets executed appropriately. And I would never rely on your student loan servicer to be, crossing their T's and dotting their I's. They're barely keeping their head above water right now, okay? So you really got to take ownership or use resources like us to help make sure you're on the right track and things are being executed well. Okay, we've got some time here. So I will open it up to any questions. Okay, so I'll start here at the beginning. Sienna had said, I thought IDR plans weren't available anymore. Nope, that's actually not accurate. So the SAVE plan is what's most likely not going to be available. And then the other piece that's still being decided by the courts is whether or not the taxable loan forgiveness pathway on PAYE and ICR is going to be available moving forward. But we don't have an answer for that quite yet. Okay. And then iterate the IBR plan, income-based repayment. That one is written into law, and so it would take a full act of Congress to make any changes there. And I don't anticipate there being enough votes in the Senate to make that a reality. So that one you should have access to. Okay. So Stephanie asked, what about the SAVE plan? Is that the same as PAYE? No, it is different. Let me show you. You can see the SAVE plan was actually really advantageous for people because you got to subtract out a higher percentage of that federal poverty limit, and then your payment was 10% of discretionary income. So for a lot of people, this was the lowest possible monthly payment was on the SAVE plan. But again, not going to exist moving forward most likely, and so I wouldn't even really bother calculating your payment on SAVE or anything like that because I don't anticipate it being an option for you. Okay, so we've got Bestis asked, do all IDR plans qualify for PSLF? Yes, PAYE, IBR, ICR, and the standard 10-year repayment all qualify for PSLF. The key here is, standard 10-year repayment does qualify, but you don't want to stay on that the whole time, right? Because it's going to make it so you don't have anything left to forgive at the end of the 10 years, right? That would defeat the whole purpose. So you could be on that for a very brief period of time. but really you want to make sure you're leveraging paying as little as possible on those 120 payments to get the most forgiven tax-free at the end. That's at the end of the day, that's the goal of PSLF, right? Okay, so Jessica asked, I'm using a Roth 401k because I have not previously seen any benefit of using a traditional 401k. Being taxed now feels better than taxed later. Should I consider splitting my contributions between traditional and Roth to lower my AGI and get more benefit of PSLF? How can I figure out the math of what's more beneficial in the long run? Oh, that's a great question. Jessica brings up a good point that if you're doing Roth 401k contributions, that does not lower your AGI. So you would not subtract out any Roth 401k contributions. Now, there are some complex calculators we can go through. We won't have time to do that tonight of, Roth versus traditional contributions in general. But when you're doing PSLF, the traditional contributions have a very significant impact on your AGI and your monthly payment. And so typically, I would lean towards traditional contributions for those doing PSLF. Now, you might still be able to max out your Roth IRA to be getting some Roth dollars still invested at that time. If you decide to do a split, that's reasonable as well, but I would make sure you're getting some pre-tax dollars invested because you want to drive that AGI down as much as possible. Now, if you're married and your partner's not doing PSLF, it opens up the opportunity for us to get really creative and have, maybe one partner's like really leveraging their Roth investments, and then our PSLF partner is really leveraging their traditional pre-tax investments, and we can find a really good balance between both of those goals. And so that opens up a lot of doors as well. Okay, Rebecca said, if we are currently on the SAVE plan, it's best to switch to IBR. And the IBR is taxable, so there would be a tax boom after 20 to 25 years. Okay, so it's hard to say for sure which income-driven repayment plan is going to be best for you. I'll try to find. Here we go. Because I don't know if you're an old or a new borrower. And if you are considered an old borrower, your payment on the pay plan is going to be lower. And so you might want to pursue the pay plan, even though it would be subject to more of the possible political changes. But it would lower your monthly payment. And so if you can get, a few qualifying payments in at that lower amount, it might be worth it. Now you had asked, IBR is taxable, right? Tax boom after 20 to 25 years. So if you're doing taxable loan forgiveness, yes, it would be either 20 or 25 years, depending on if you're an old or a new borrower on IBR. And then any amount that's forgiven after that 20 to 25 years would be taxed as ordinary income. And so that's that tax bomb that you mentioned. If you're doing public service loan forgiveness, any amount forgiven at the end of that 10 years is tax-free forgiveness. And so that's a very important distinction to make. So Tyler asked, my payments are set to start in June, currently in the IBR queue. I've signed the PSLF document and sent it to my employer. Perfect. Any idea how my payments in June will be marked? Standard versus IBR, PSLF qualified versus unqualified. I don't know if they'll have your application processed in time or not. It might be a month or two of standard 10-year repayment. I'm hopeful that that wouldn't be the case, but potentially that might happen if they can't process it fast enough. In terms of whether or not it would be PSLF qualifying, both the income-based repayment and standard 10-year repayment count towards PSLF. So as long as your employer retroactively confirms that you are working full-time during those months, then you would get credit for those months. So I hope that helps to at least alleviate the PSLF concern. And then Hannah asked, will the buyback method still be an option for PSLF? Very good question. It depends on when you're trying to pursue PSLF buyback. If you're not familiar with that, what PSLF buyback is once you've had 120 months of qualifying employment, you can go in and request to make a lump sum payment to like buy back any months that you were in forbearance while working at that qualifying employer. But the key is you have to have 120 months of qualifying employment. So this really right now only applies to people who are really close to hitting that PSLF forgiveness threshold, and PSLF buyback is still available. And so if that's you and you're like, next month I hit my 120 months of employment, then yes, PSLF buyback should be a valid option for you. If you're 5 years from now, who knows? That's something that's probably going to be discussed in this negotiated rulemaking. So I think PSLF buyback is probably going to be safe until at least July of 2026. Beyond that, I truly don't know if it will be an option, so I wouldn't bank on it if you're farther out from PSLF forgiveness. If you're really close to it, you can probably feel confident that you'll have access to PSLF buyback for the next year. Okay, so Felicia said, are we able to recertify our employment right now? I have tried recently and the website was not cooperating. Totally fair. Yes, you can. The fastest way to do it is through the aid.gov website where you send it electronically to your employer. You will need to know the email address that it needs to go to through your employer, but I've had multiple people have success with this going through within a week, like very quick turnaround. For those that have tried to do the paper copy and have their employer sign it and then they send it in, we've seen significant delays in that being processed. And so if your employer is willing to do it electronically, I think you'll have a lot more success going that direction. Rebecca asked if loans and forbearance will be subject to that wage garnishing in May. No, that only is if your loans are in default, which means that you were supposed to make a payment and you failed to do so. And you would receive written notice if you're in default and being considered for this wage garnishing process. So forbearance is a very different state. You will not have your wages garnished. Don't worry about that if you're in forbearance. Okay, Natalie asked a golden question. I haven't invested anything in my 401k. How do I know what to invest into? I would need at least another hour to answer that question adequately. I will say in the club, we have a lot of sources available talking about the investing aspects and kind of how to get started. So if that's something you want to learn more about, which you should, now is a great time to like really dig into that and feel confident on an investing plan. We're here to help navigate that. I just cannot answer that in a short period of time. That's a very big question, but a really good one. And I'm glad you're thinking about it. Now is the time. Let's dive into that further. So Noah was answering that question. Daisy said, currently on save administrative forbearance. Once they get rid of it and we change to the IBR plan, is this when income is recertified? Fantastic question, Daisy. So there's two pathways that this could go. One is they get rid of the save plan and then they say, okay, everyone who's on the save needs to switch to an income-driven repayment plan, a different one, probably will say IBR. And they could say, you know, to minimize the amount of paperwork involved, we're going to use the income that was already on file and just recalculate it for IBR. That's one approach. Or they might say everyone needs to submit new income certification to figure out what your payment will be on IBR. I could see it going either way. They're going to be so bogged down in the 2 million IDR applications currently in the queue that I could see them saying like, look, we just need to minimize the paperwork at this time to be able to get things done. And so I could see them just saying, hey, let's use the income that's already on file. But then I could also see them saying, look, a lot of people's income has increased a lot since they last recertified. Like if you were in active repayment going into the COVID pandemic, you probably haven't recertified your income since like 2019 or early 2020. So your income is hopefully much higher now. And so I could see them saying, you know, we want to capture more of that money coming back to us, but it would come with a huge paperwork lift for them to navigate. So I don't know how they're going to approach that. My hunch is that they would use the income that's already on file just to ease that administrative workload. But I think you need to be ready from a tax filing status and everything and pre-tax investments and everything. Be ready to have to recertify your income at any time. Okay, so Levi said, is it beneficial to switch from Roth to 457 from a student loan perspective if you're already maxing out your 403B and HSA already? So I guess the question is like, how much do you want to try to leverage your PSLF? If you want to do pre-tax 457B contributions, that's another 23,500 that you can subtract from your AGI. That's, or from your gross income to get your AGI. That's huge. So I would leverage the heck out of that. But you could also say like, maybe I want to still get some Roth dollars. I can do my Roth IRA, or I could have a partner leverage their Roth investments. A lot of times it gets so nuanced of like, how do we do this in your individual situation based on how much you're investing, what accounts you have access to, whether or not you're married, and what accounts they have access to. This is when having that like 30,000 foot view individualized plan really comes into play. Okay, Christine said, is there an upper limit of income for which PSLF does not make sense? So you have to be able to demonstrate that partial financial hardship where your payment on the IDR plan is higher, or payment on IDR plan would be lower than your standard 10-year repayment. So I would say if you have a very, very high income, but more importantly, a high or a low debt to income ratio, you may not be able to qualify for an income-driven repayment plan, which really limits the benefit of PSLF. Now, for a lot of our really high earners, if you want to be a neurosurgeon, for example, you have a lot of years of training in which your income isn't actually that high. And so you can still a lot of times leverage PSLF during those low earning years and maybe only have 1 or 2 years of high income where you're maybe paying a lot more. But oftentimes we can get pretty strategic from a tax filing and income recertification standpoint to try to maximize the benefit of PSLF if you're somebody whose income is going to all of a sudden increase significantly, maybe when you hit like attending level or something like that. Okay, I'm not going to be able to get to all of these questions. These are so many great ones. I see one really good question here. Am I able to apply for PSLF right now? Yes, go ahead and submit that application. It should be getting processed. It should be. If not, by May 10th, it should get started getting processed, but I would go ahead and fill that out quickly. If they get rid of pay, will it automatically get switched into something, or do I have to reapply? TBD. We'll have to stay tuned to see if they're going to automatically recalculate or if they're going to ask for new income certification. Let's see. Best way to find a PSLF qualifying employer. So there is actually, if you Google PSLF employer eligibility, there is an online tool through studentaid.gov where you can search that employer's tax filing EIN number and it'll tell you whether or not they're PSLF qualifying. And so that's super helpful as you're, pursuing a job search and trying to figure out what your options are that would allow you to do PSLF. So it'll ask for the employer's EIN. And if you just Google like Indiana University EIN, it will come up on Google and you can put that into this search bar. Okay, I'm going to take one more question because I've already gone over. Okay, this is a good, I don't know if other people are stressed about this, but Levi asked, I've seen headlines about PSLF being canceled in entirety. Is there any truth or risk of that? So that is written into a statute. The process of PSLF is written into law, so it would take an act of Congress to eliminate that altogether. I think that is highly unlikely. There would be a lot of pushback if they tried to eliminate that altogether. Even when that has been proposed in the past, and all those bills have failed, but even when it's been proposed in the past, they grandfathered in anyone that was actively pursuing it, and those changes would have only applied to new borrowers. So I would anticipate, even if somehow they got a bill through Congress that was going to eliminate PSLF, they would still grandfather in current borrowers, would be my presumption. That's how it's always been proposed in the past, and even those proposals have failed. Good questions, guys. I wish I could answer all of these. We would be here for probably another hour. These are fantastic questions coming through. I'm glad you're all in the club. This is exactly, a great place to be learning these things and figuring out like how to take that next step in your financial journey. Keep in mind that the student loans are one piece of the puzzle, okay? You've got to zoom out. You've got to look at that 30,000 foot view and piece it together from an investing, savings, student loan, other debt. All of it needs to cohesively work together to get you exactly where you want to go. So let us know how we can help make that a reality. I'm glad you guys were able to join tonight. Thanks for coming on. Let us know what else you guys need. And if there's any other topics that you're like, ooh, I'd love to see a live event on this, throw it on the discussion board. Let us know what you're interested in and we'll make it happen. All right, guys. Well, have a good rest of your night. Thanks again for joining me, and I will see you in the club.